Hello, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Milan Stark, and I'm here both in my capacity as chair of the U.S. Chamber's Global Innovation Policy Center and Executive Vice President and Chief Counsel for IP at NBC Universal. More broadly, I'm here because I'm a firm believer in the power of intellectual property. It is a power that presents itself in numerous ways. It is a power tool. It helps us to innovate and create to solve problems. It's a power player. It encourages investment in new ideas, even when the risks are substantial. And IP is a power source. It drives economic growth and social well-being. The International IP Index takes these metaphors and makes them material. It gives us the data we need, not just to prove our points, but to prompt policy change. For those of you who may not be familiar, the International IP Index benchmarks the global IP system economy by economy, suggesting actionable measures that governments can use to improve their individual IP architectures. And with 10 years of benchmarking under our belt, we can definitively say that the index's insights aren't going unnoticed. Without revealing too much data, I definitely don't want to steal the thunder of our next speaker. Let me just say that the scores of virtually all countries included in the index have measurably improved since the index's inception. So countries are making the changes they need to make to participate in the global innovation ecosystem. And consistent with the theme of this year's index, we believe governments are investing in the changes needed to compete for a better tomorrow. Of course, there's still more work to be done. The index also illustrates how weakening IP rights can undercut people's access to the latest technologies, creative works, and breakthrough medicines across the globe. Dangerous proposals to surrender IP protections, like those under consideration at WTO, risk making this a reality. So if we are to build upon the momentum on global IP protection we have seen in the last decade of index research, we must ensure that governments around the world and in multilateral forums understand the value of effective IP protection. The index demonstrates that there is concrete value in making a conscious policy decision to invest in IP. The data shows that countries with the most effective IP ecosystems have greater foreign investment, increased and earlier access to creative content and innovative output, and greater global competitiveness. So it is with that reason that today we celebrate. We celebrate that the U.S. Chamber has released 10 editions of this important report, and we celebrate that innovators and creators aren't just getting through this pandemic, we're coming out stronger. And with this new edition of the index in hand, we can multiply that strength even further. So to help us understand how to do that, we have with us lead researcher and author on the index, Meyer Pugach. Meyer founded Pugach Consilium, an economic and policy analysis firm in 2008, and has worked on the index since its inception, leveraging his expertise in intellectual property policy, management and exploitation of knowledge assets, technology transfer, and market access. In addition to his work at Pugach Consilium, Meyer is a professor at the University of Haifa, Israel, and a visiting professor at the postgraduate program on intellectual property law and knowledge management at the University of Maastricht. Meyer is also an accomplished author and editor and serves as a board member for several peer-reviewed academic journals. So Meyer, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to hearing more about this year's index, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Milan, and thank you so much for the US Chamber. If I may start just by providing a small personal anecdote, because we are in fact talking about 10 years of research. But if I may go even before 10 years, 20 years ago, not very long after I finished my PhD at the London School of Economics on IP issues, I published my first paper on issues concerning indexing. At the time, I came up with an idea that you can measure intellectual property environments not only based on certain types of rights, but also based on certain types of sectors. And when I submitted it to various peer-reviewed journals, the idea seemed to be interesting, apparently, and they've published that, but that was an academic work. It took a few years and a few models until the US Chamber was so generous in coming and telling me and my team, hey, why don't you take your idea from the academic world into the practical world. And now, 10 years later, I'm so excited to tell you that my own personal story of how I turned into idea to a standard is also the idea and the narrative behind the index. How IP eventually helps different countries and different economies to fulfill the economic potential that is in their own countries. So with that, may I go to the slides and do a share of the slides and present you a few slides relating to the studies. I think the overall story of the index this year after 10 years is about the global economic recovery. And yes, we are finding ourselves again in perilous times, and I'll put that aside for a second. But if we look at COVID, we see that there is some certain elements of recovery that were not there before just 2 years ago. 2 years ago and even a year ago, economics, GDP was shrinking in different countries across the regions. But this time we expect economic recovery to resume. And what I would like to suggest that a big part of that economic recovery is essentially related to intellectual property rights and the IP related products and services that are based on these forms of protection. Because if we look on technology, the technology that we just use now, the entire world shifted to digital tools that still allow us to connect, still allow us to work, to collaborate, to maintain some kind of a momentum and even harness it. And all of these technologies were based eventually on one or another form of intellectual property protection. Without these IP forms, this digital space and digital space tools would not have been introduced or leveraged so quickly. Licenses of sorts. So this is one way how IP-based tools moved forward the entire digital space that we are using. Of course, on the other spectrum, we see how IP-based tools and IP-based ecosystem have paved the way for pharmaceutical companies and the biopharma industry essentially to save humanity. Because vaccines and the other treatments that are related to vaccine, be it medicines, antibiotics, medical devices, inhalers, screening machines, they are all based on intellectual property. And this is what essentially allowed humanity to start to get out of COVID, or at the very least to be able to live alongside the COVID pandemic and to make it from a pandemic to an endemia. So this is where again IP have paved the way. However, as always with intellectual property, there is always an emotional and a political and ideological conflicts that are part of the discussion. And we do see some developments that, at least in our view, seem to be contradictory to what the reality suggests. On the one hand, we see the WTO agrees to extend again the TRIPS transition period for least developed countries till July 3rd, 2034. Personally, I was a bit saddened by that because essentially for me it was marking that some countries cannot be part of the game, and I don't believe it is to be so. But that was the decision. An even more disputed decision is the extent to which waiving part or the entire elements of the TRIPS sections is indeed producive and conducive to assist fighting COVID. And I think that while this debate is still being discussed and maybe put on hold for a bit, I think it would be a grave mistake to assume that waiving IPRs is the way forward, because I truly believe, as the index will show and as the data shows, that if anything, intellectual property was a big part of the solution. So, what did we find in this decade long of research? Just to perhaps give some historical context, we moved up from 11 economies when we just started to more than 55 countries. And we moved from 25 indicators to 50 indicators. All in all, we have more than close to 3,000, 4,000 resources and data points that we look at. That's a serious bulk of research, which is being conducted and done throughout the entire year. So this is not something we just decide upon doing, finger testing of the wind direction. This is a really consistent effort throughout the entire year for 10 years now. And what did we find? I think that what we found and what we find now is very encouraging, because I think that the world do get it. Despite all the decisions and despite all the disputes and despite all the conflicts, we believe that the world is in a better IP shape than it was 10 years ago. Things are improving, and a big part of it is because that the policy discussion and the policy debates are based more on data rather than just views. And this data also helps countries to make decisions that, in our view and in my personal view, are in the right direction. Having said that, we still see that the improvement is gradual and that there is still a long way to go to reach what we believe is a much more optimal level of intellectual property protection across different countries. Now, if we look at the results of the IP index for this year, here are some insights, which, of course, by the way, the US Chamber then website provides a wealth of information and a wealth of data about the IP index. You can cut and slice and dice it based on different sectors and based on different countries, be it protection on the books, be it protection on the ground. If you want to look at a specific IP right or specific issues, things can be extracted. But if I take a look overall, I say that nobody is perfect and no country gets a perfect score. But we do see a significant group of countries where they have a fairly decent to a very robust intellectual property protection. And that's a cause for celebration. However, if you look on the right-hand side, you still see that the variance is still too big in our view, and that there is still a long way to go for improving some IP systems for certain countries, that it's not even improving in the sense of just trying to change things, but it's also about changing a mindset, trying to understand that if you go to the right direction, rewards would follow. So I think this is something that we want to drive and persuade different countries with the data, that moving up the scale is not only a legal decision or a political decision, but an economic and societal decision. we do want to emphasize that when we do the index and when we do the research around it, that we are not only trying to provide a snapshot of intellectual property environments. For us, and as someone who's been dealing with policy research for more than 25 years, it's pivotal to understand how certain policy elements feed into outputs, how they feed into behavior, how they feed into outcomes, how they feed into creation. And that is why we have measured the scores of the intellectual property index with across a myriad of other data points, close to 30 types of correlations that look at job creation, access to license, rates of R&D spending, human capital, foreign direct investment, access to digital technologies, patent protection in inventive activities, and so on and so forth. And what we find is that all the arrows point to the right direction. Let me give you just a few examples, because obviously the entire research can be found in the index website and the data. So if we look at how countries are ready for what we call the fourth industrial revolution, which means the use of digital, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, everything which is the future, we see that countries that have the right intellectual property environments are much more ready to use the fourth industrial revolution and to benefit from that. That's one data point. Another data point is that we see how there is a relationship that intellectual property rights are also as a proxy for a much broader innovation ecosystem. And we see how they are correlate and how they speak and how they associate with other measures like the Global Innovation Index. So when we talk about IP, we don't only talk about the protection of rights, but we talk about an entire innovation and creation mindset. We also see that countries that have stronger intellectual property rights will also drive and pull and attract more types and more numbers of clinical research and clinical trials into their respective countries, which we've seen this pandemic, how it is so critical, because access to these clinical trials also mean early access to pharmaceuticals and medical technologies and essentially better health. So again, another data point to remember. But let's think about other elements, because one of the debates that we see in this field is that some critics are concerned that intellectual property only benefit the economic growth of developed countries, only benefit the ability of different countries in terms of their own economic level of development. So we try to measure that as well. So when we look at the developed economies, obviously we come to what may be predictable, but still very important to note, that intellectual property rights play a significant role of domestic GDP. So we see almost 40% of GDP in the US can be associated to IP-related activities. That's a very significant chunk. But what about other countries? So we see that in the EU and Korea, we also see similar levels, that intellectual property related activities account for 50% of GDP almost and 30% of employment. Again, the emphasis here is about domestic economy. If we move to Australia, we see the difference between how beneficial intellectual property rights businesses generate profits and incomes and also pay for taxes compared to non-IP related activities. But the thing that we found most that encouraged us was that when you look at Brazil and Mexico, for example, as well as other countries, you see that the level of contribution of IP-related rights to GDP and employment is very similar to that of developed countries. So essentially, we now understand that this is not only a developed country game, it's an innovation mindset game. And even the developing countries that adopt this innovation and creativity mindset game are able to reap the rewards as we see in the data. So to conclude, we try every year to benchmark things consistently and systematically. It's not an easy task. We try to look at the data. We try to map and benchmark different countries and different activities. But we think, and what we believe and see, is that intellectual property rights, especially in stormy periods, are a strong anchor in the way that the economy is based and managed, and a very powerful engine for growth. And I hope I was able to at least provide you a glimpse. And I thank you very much. And thank you, Maylin. And thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Kelly, and the entire US Chamber and the entire IP Index team for allowing me and my team the privilege of this partnership. Thank you so much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jen Walton, and I'm Vice President of U.S. Government Relations at Pfizer. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Tim Moss, who I don't think needs an introduction, but for those who don't know, he is the Chief Executive and Comptroller General at the UK IPO. And Tim is responsible for advising ministers on all IP matters and for the operation of the office. So he's the perfect partner for this conversation today. So Tim, the UK has long been a leader in IP protection and enforcement, so standing side by side with the US at the top of the rankings in the US Chamber International IP Index. In particular, the UK has historically led the way in the enforcement rankings given the world-class IP enforcement framework. So can you talk a little bit and share with us why the UK has prioritized creating a gold standard IP framework?
Thank you, Jen. I think at the start of this, it's because enforcement and protection of rights really matters. At the end of the day, rights are only as good as their ability to be protected and enforced. And so it's really important that every country and every IP office really has this as a priority, and is central to the way that we can look after and help people with their rights. And certainly in the UK, we're really proud of some of the work we've done in the past and believe that we are up there setting a gold standard with the US and others in terms of the protection and enforcement of rights. And we've recently just launched our new counter-infringement strategy, which really sets the scene for the next few years and builds on the success, and we believe will help us to maintain and build on that gold standard. And central to that is the ability to really sort of focus and prioritize the issues in the enforcement space. One of the things we recognize from the work we've done in the past is that you can put an awful lot of resources and you can spread yourselves very thinly in looking at this whole area of the protection and enforcement of rights. And so it's really important that we prioritize where we can make the biggest impact in terms of helping people to protect their rights, but also to enforce and to work against those that cease to infringe, that want to infringe IP rights. And central to that new strategy is what we're terming as doing a strategic threat and harm assessment. We're putting a lot of investment into our intelligence hub that we have within the UK office, and our ability to really understand the threats to IP rights from criminals and those that want to infringe them. And central to that assessment will be then setting out the priorities going forward. Once we're clear on what they are, and our new strategy has three elements to it around partnership, education, and leadership. What we recognize is, as an IP office, we are part of the system to improve the enforcement and protection of rights. And we work with law enforcement colleagues, with other offices, with other agencies to make sure the UK and internationally can be a safe place for people with IP rights. Education is absolutely key. We need to make sure that people really understand how they can protect their rights, and they do that at the earliest stage. And also, they understand the risks to the infringement of their rights. And the final bit around leadership is making sure that we are really talking about the successes, sharing good practice with colleagues both in the UK and overseas, to ensure that we all work collectively to create the best environment to protect IP rights, and ensure that we work hard to ensure that infringement is minimized.
That's great, Tim. And it sounds like you clearly kind of have a plan for the future on how the UK can continue to lead the way. As you talk about the partnership and education, are there any other strategies that you and the government have to ensure that the UK continues to be a leader in IP enforcement?
I think one of the things we want to do is work very closely with colleagues internationally. With other IP offices, with the World Intellectual Property Organization, as well as many stakeholder groups across the world. IP infringement is a global issue. It knows no national boundaries, and we need to have this collective effort between offices, law enforcement, and organizations across the world to make sure we create the best environment to protect IP and really make some significant inroads into those that seek to infringe IP. So it's at the heart of, we believe, the IP strategy, and is hugely important, and one that we're keen to promote and really work with others on.
Yeah, Tim, that's a really excellent point. I mean, about IP being a collective, focus that we all need to have together. So I really appreciate hearing that. Tim, I'd love to hear, the Chambers Index illustrates how economies with the most effective IP frameworks are more likely to receive a host of socioeconomic benefits. So this includes greater innovative output, increased access to venture capital, more foreign investment, and all of these ultimately make them more globally competitive. So from your perspective, are there distinct policy areas within IP that help achieve these goals?
I think the simple answer is absolutely yes. But I think the first point I want to make is I don't think it's about IP. IP is there to incentivize and encourage innovation and creativity, and we must always remember that. Too often as IP offices, we can be very inward looking and think it's all about the IP rights. But IP rights exist to really help that innovation and creativity ecosystem to work, and that's at the heart of creating those social economic benefits that you've just referred to. It was great to see that last summer the UK government launched its innovation strategy, which contains a whole range of policies and a number of things to really help encourage innovation and creativity in the UK. And IP and the IP policies are at the heart of that. And I think there are a few that I think that are hugely important as we move forward, and ensure that IP becomes a real force for good. And I think one of the central elements of this is making sure that people recognize that IP is an asset. Our economies are based on intangible assets more than they are physical assets these days, and IP needs to be considered that way. And businesses need to understand that and ensure that treating IP as an asset is at the heart of enabling their business to grow. One of the key things that we're looking at is actually the policies around IP and finance and access to finance, and making sure that the financial system and organizations in that area really understand IP and understand the value that it creates, and that it can be treated as an asset. So one of the things we're doing is developing a sort of IP finance strategy. On the back of that, we're also looking to ensure that we've got the right support mechanisms, especially for small and medium enterprises. Our office, we run a couple of schemes, one called IP Audit, another one called IP Access, which are there to really help businesses to understand the IP they have and then make the best use of it, to ensure and really help their businesses to grow. And at the heart of this, I think, is also the real need to ensure that businesses and individuals really understand IP. They know how to access it and they know how to use it. And importantly, I think that they understand IP at the very beginning of their business. It shouldn't be something extra, but it should be something that's part of their overarching business strategy. And when they're doing business planning, when they're thinking about their business, they understand the IP they may have, the IP they're going to generate, and how they can use it to really support and help grow their business. So education, I think, is key, ensuring that everybody knows when to ask the right questions about IP as part of their business development.
Yeah, Tim, I think those are really great points and something that I think we all need to keep in mind as we represent different industries and different businesses, of ensuring kind of the IP is the foundation for everything that we do, and ensuring that there is that focus there. So thank you for that. Tim, I want to ask a question about, just underrepresented communities. So through the Chamber's Equality of Opportunity Initiative, the Global Innovation Policy Center has focused on ways that diversity in IP ownership can promote economic opportunity in underrepresented communities. Can you talk a little bit about how the UK IPO is striving to create equal opportunities within the system to promote greater diversity and inclusion, regardless of gender or background?
Certainly. I think that the key thing here is, IP is for everyone. There should be no boundaries. There should be no limits. As we've just been talking, it's at the heart of innovation and creativity, and everyone is innovative, everyone is creative, and we need to make sure that the IP system really works for everybody. And a couple of things that we've been doing as an office. One has been the research work that we do. So we've published in the past some really key reports around IP, inventorship, and gender, and that's shown in the past that women are underrepresented in terms of the patenting process and inventorship, and that needs to change. We're also just about to publish a report about ethnicity and inventorship. And we should be looking at this at any sort of group with protected characteristics, and see where does the IP system not work for them in the way that it should do, because IP is for everyone. And then internally as an office is an area where we recognize it's hugely important to us. We want to be an office that is there for everybody, that everyone feels able to be a part of. And central to that is actually understanding the current situation, making sure we collect the right data from our current staff, and also those who want to come and work with us, to ensure that we do represent the society that we serve. And so, making sure we've got the right information and data is really, really important to start with. And then looking at where are the areas that we need to improve. We've done work over the last year or so looking at when we recruit, to ensure that we're attracting people from all sectors of society. And as they go through that whole recruitment process, that at every single stage, it's working for everybody. And that we've changed some of the way that we do assessments of candidates, to make sure that there is no unconscious bias or anything within those processes, and they're as fair as they possibly can be for everybody. But we also recognise, I think, especially in the IP space, where and certainly in the UK, the area we work in is ones that are very heavy in terms of the science, technology, engineering, and maths, or STEM subjects, that as we refer to them. And traditionally, they don't have a great representation across all areas of society. They tend to be very male dominated as subjects right the way through the education system. And so we're working with others to ensure that we can correct that as we can over time. But these are long-term issues. So one of the schemes we've had as an office over the last couple of years is something called our STEM Returners Scheme, which has been for people from underrepresented groups who maybe have taken a career break from a STEM subject. And we've been encouraging them back in and giving them work experience so they feel more able to come back into the workplace. And it was really great that actually in our last patent examiner recruitment, one of our STEM returners was successful in terms of getting a permanent role. We've also just been doing some work with an initiative in the UK called Code First Girls, which is encouraging women to be involved in the technical areas around coding and IT. And we've run a couple of mass online open courses to encourage more people to get involved and be part of that. And we have a range of sort of staff-led networks focusing on the issues and ensuring that wherever possible, we are eliminating any bias or discrimination in any of the systems that we have as an office. So really important that we tackle these issues. We're also involved in something in the UK called IP Inclusive, which is a collaboration between us as the IP office and with the professional bodies that represent patent attorneys and the wider IP system, looking at inclusion issues across the whole of the IP profession, and coming up with things to ensure that we improve the situation and make sure that IP is an industry for everybody.
Tim, that's really exciting to hear. And I know that I can speak on behalf of the entire GIPC community to say that we stand ready to work with you on these initiatives, because it is really critical. And certainly the future is as we all collectively work to promote and protect IP. So thank you for that. And Tim, unfortunately, I see that we're at time. So we have to close our conversation, but I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and truly to thank you and the entire UK IPO team. You are truly fantastic partners. We very much appreciate that partnership, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. So thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to engaging with you again very soon.
Thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen and Tim. Thanks as well to Mayor Pugach. Thank you. Thank you, Jen and Tim, Mayor Pugach, Milan Stark, everyone behind 10 years of the U.S. Chamber International IP Index. Tim Moss gave us a real tour de force there, and I hope governments around the world, including ours here in the United States, were taking notes. A lot of great ideas about how countries can capitalize on the intellectual capital that is abundant in their own economies. Tim said a couple things that I want to pick up on as we wrap up today's program and the launch of the 10th edition of the International IP Index. First, he said IP is a means to an end. And that's very true. And we've seen those ends very clearly during the COVID pandemic. We've seen industries as diverse as life sciences, advanced manufacturing, telecommunications, arts and entertainment, and many others providing real-time solutions through technologies that were not only unavailable just a few years ago, but really undreamt of. And we've been able to provide these real-time solutions based only on years of investment, decades really, underpinned by intellectual property rights. And so when we think of intellectual property as a means to an end, it's important that we think not only about the economic impacts of the sort that Mayor described, the job creation, the contributions to global domestic product, but we also need to think about the economic functions of intellectual property. And I'll speak to two of those. First and foremost, intellectual property enables the private sector to invest in solutions that are going to be years away for problems that we may not yet have foreseen, as this novel coronavirus illustrated so well. So what does that mean to enable private sector investment? It means that because of the reliability and predictability of intellectual property rights, businesses are able to tap financial markets, equity markets, venture capital, and to allocate resources to high risk, long-term, capital intensive projects that are very likely to fail, and that more often than not do fail. But because of the strength of intellectual property rights, they can make that front end investment with the assurance that if they succeed, they can earn a return on their investment and continue to sustain the cycle of innovation. The second critical function of intellectual property, and again, we've seen this during the pandemic, is the way that it connects a diverse set of stakeholders to create an innovation ecosystem. We look in terms of investment in advancements of knowledge. We look at government funding of early stage scientific research. We look at the role of research universities in carrying out those projects. We look at the role of our startup economy and venture capital, and even much larger companies in continuing to advance our knowledge gains and translate them into practical applications, real world applications that can actually solve problems, exactly as we saw with the application of mRNA technology under development for decades to create a vaccine in real time during the pandemic. And as we look forward, we know that there will be other crises. This pandemic is not the last of its kind. And the next crisis may be environmental, it may be agricultural, or as we watch with grave concern and even horror as events unfold in Ukraine today, It may be a global energy crisis. Regardless of the nature of the challenges that we face as a global human society, private sector innovation, private sector investment in innovation and creativity is critical to our ability to overcome these challenges, to deliver the solutions that will allow us to move forward, to be safe, to be productive, to live balanced and connected lives. And that brings me to the second point that Tim left us with, which is that IP is for everyone. It is not just a handful of wealthy countries trying to profit off of technological solutions. It's a means, as Tim said, a means to an end of connecting everyone everywhere. And what the U.S. Chamber International IP Index does, really for the first time, is help countries see in a very discrete and specific fashion the architecture of the innovation economy that allows all of those stakeholders to work together. And it, in 50 discrete indicators, provides a roadmap for countries to be part of that innovation ecosystem. So today, as we're listening to a global debate about the role of intellectual property and vaccine equity and access to other creative and technological solutions, it's critical to remember that to be a part of the innovation ecosystem, you have to have a strong IP system. You have to provide the tools for stakeholders in your country to connect with stakeholders around the world. And if we can do that together, if we can use this IP index tool to help us get there, then the innovation that is latent in every country in the world can really come to life. We can build the knowledge capital that is inherent in each of us, and we can be part of the knowledge economy. That's our fond wish for the International IP Index and for the international community. We want to thank you all for joining us today to listen as we roll out this 10th anniversary edition of the index. Please use it. It's a tool and it's there for you. Thank you very much.